Hello, my name is Christopher Scott from the Biblical Leadership blog at christopherscottblog.com. And today I'm going to talk to you about how a volunteer program can recruit volunteers for their work and ministry. So, to give you a little bit of background on this, for 5 years in California when I lived out there, I ran a nonprofit program called A Day of Hope, where we would gather food and resources throughout the year. Then we would assemble all those resources, the food, put them in boxes, and then have volunteers go deliver them to families in need in Thanksgiving. And so with a group of other people out there in California, I was able to work with them, and we would plan, recruit volunteers, gather money and resources, and then put that material together and help families out every Thanksgiving. And so in 5 years of doing that, we were able to feed more than 500 families and more than 2,000 people as a result of that work. And all of that work was done through the help of volunteers, which was interesting because we all were volunteers running the program. So this video is going to give you the steps that I usually followed and that the group I worked with, what we usually did to recruit volunteers for our ministry and our work. So the first thing that we did, I'll just kind of go through, I'll just tell you exactly what we did. Maybe it helps you if you work with volunteers and have to recruit volunteers. So the first thing we did as we planned thoroughly and early. Okay, so our work was always done in November is when we delivered the baskets of food and turkeys. Usually the Sunday before Thanksgiving is when we did the work. So throughout the year we would plan, but we would start early, usually in about April or May. And we'd start by planning our car washes, which was one of our main fundraising areas. We would plan our food gathering events, which usually happened the first 2 weeks of November. And then we would plan our food sorting weekend, which was usually the weekend that we delivered the baskets, which would be on Saturday. We would sort the food Saturday, but deliver it Sunday. So because we delivered the food Sunday, we would sort the food on Saturday. So when we planned thoroughly throughout our year, we wouldn't try to figure out exactly how many volunteers we needed. Most of all, we'd try to figure out, okay, we need at least 3 people. Maybe up to 5 or 6, that's fine. But we would try to think of, okay, what's the bare minimum amount of people we need for these events? We'd also pick a max. So we don't need more than 10. We need at least 3, but no more than 10. We can get by with 3, we can get by with 10, but if 20 show up, we're going to be in trouble because we don't have enough work for them to do. We also discussed some of the needs that we had for volunteers. So if we needed a volunteer to design some flyers, we need to find somebody that knows how to use Publisher or Adobe. Photoshop is the other one, I think. Whatever people use to design flyers. Clearly, I was not the one designing the flyers. But if we had volunteer needs and special skills for those volunteer positions, we would try to talk about that too as we were planning. The next thing that we would do to recruit volunteers is that we would list our volunteer opportunities in as many different places as we possibly could, right? And when we posted the volunteer needs, we'd always put our vision on there. We'd put the date and time that volunteers are needed, where the volunteer activity would be located, and who to contact if they had questions. Pretty much are the 4 things: the vision, the date and time, the location, and then who to contact. Are the 4 things you always need on every single position, volunteer recruitment posting that you ever make. So that's what we posted. Where we posted the information is mostly to the local volunteer center, which was at the local United Way. So they had a volunteer center at our local United Way, and we would give them information on our volunteer needs, and they did a really great job of promoting that information because they already had existing relationships with radio stations, newspapers, local podcasts, things like that. So they really helped to kind of spread the message once we got it to them. However, if you use a local volunteer center, you need to be very clear about how many volunteers you need, so they know. So if they get 20 phone calls of people wanting to volunteer for you, but they know you only have 10 positions available, they'll screen those people out for you, or they'll stop referring you volunteers when you no longer need them. So when you do work with the volunteer center, you got to give them the information they need, but also let them know what's the maximum amount of volunteers that you can handle. Then we posted the information to a local volunteer center. We posted them to websites, to 1-800-volunteer.org, to idealist.org, volunteermatch.org. That was actually the most helpful and the best referral source. And then local radio stations and local TV stations, sometimes they'd have a community calendar that you can hop in there and type in your events and ask for volunteers. So we would do that as much as we could. We also tried to recruit volunteers and posted that information at local universities. So we had the California State University Stanislaus in the city where we did this work. So we would show up to the student dorm move-in day, and I would try to gather volunteers to go to that move-in day, and they just show up, at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they just help these new students move into their dorms. And in the process, kind of part of the deal is that whoever helps the students move in, you get to kind of promote your organization. So usually fraternities, sororities, clubs like that would do it. And us as a local nonprofit, we would often help. And I try to send some students who lived near campus or on campus who were students. They could try to recruit some new people that needed some things to do. We would also go to the new student orientation and the dorm activity fair, where they would have booths for local programs that can show up and talk about their program, and that's something we would do at the local university. Additionally, the third thing we did is we emailed, called, and or texted past volunteers from past events. So I always did my best to gather people's name, phone number, and email address if they wanted to stay involved with us. And so I would sometimes call them. I'd call the people I knew who had good hearts and I knew wanted to help and ask them if they wanted to volunteer. Sometimes I would text people. Sometimes, especially the millennials, kind of have a love-hate relationship with phones and email, but they like texting. So sometimes I would text them. And then additionally, I would call local businesses that I know had a philanthropic program. So for example, Kohl's has what I don't know what they call it now, but they used to call it their A-team. So basically it was a program where if 5 Kohl's employees go and volunteer for 4 hours, Kohl's will make a $500 donation to that nonprofit. So every single time we had an event, I tried to get Kohl's to show up because we get an extra $500 just for them coming, basically. The fourth thing that we did to recruit volunteers is to give presentations. This is probably something I did a lot of, actually, that worked really good. So I'd go to local university, to their service clubs, to their fraternities, to their sorority meetings, any place I could go to talk about our work and try to get students involved in the community, I would do. And so when I talked, I'd try to, 3 things I always tried to do. I tried to be passionate, show them that this is something I'm passionate about. I tried to talk slowly and explain clearly, and I always made an ask for people to volunteer. I didn't ask them for money. I didn't ask them for, to volunteer 2 hours a week for the entire year. I said, hey, we have 3 events. I just need people to show up for like an hour and a half if you want to help and support the community. And the last thing that we did is we utilized what Seth Godin calls permission marketing, which is basically the idea of you try to gather people's names and email addresses and phone numbers. You don't have to do it coercively. You just have to be intentional to provide those opportunities for people to learn more and to opt in, right? So anytime we had a volunteer show up, I'd always have a little piece of paper there saying, if you want to learn more about our program or you want to keep updated about future volunteer needs, put your email address here. And people, maybe 1 out of every 3 people would do that. But when you have 200 volunteers coming, that's 60 people a day that you get added to your email list, things like that. So those are the 5 things really that we did for A Day of Hope to try to recruit volunteers and support the work in the community. In some of my past videos, if you've seen those, I try to give specific ideas. How do you interview volunteers? How do you cast wide and deep to recruit volunteers? How do you craft a vision statement that will recruit volunteers? This one is a little bit more practical, where I just want to tell you exactly what we did, and that's what we did. We utilized permission marketing. We did presentations. We conducted outreach to local universities, things like that. So my name is Christopher Scott from the Biblical Leadership Blog. If you are curious to learn more about volunteer recruitment, I'll put a little link in the comments section of this video, and you can learn more on my blog. Thanks again for tuning in. Hope you have success in recruiting volunteers for your nonprofit or church.